So I do remember, however, promising you guys the take-home exam. I'll do that for you guys in lab. In lab for us, because we're that one lab behind, is going to be salivary amylase. That's lab 8. So our quiz would be 7 retrospective, 8 prospective. So that's what that'll be. So everything looks good online. I don't see any other people in the waiting rooms. So let's go ahead and dig in. So the margarine effect, right? So this is our segue. By the way, that's not a thing. That's a total meism, right? So you don't expect to see that in a book somewhere. That's just kind of the way I think. Okay, so what exactly is the margarine effect? First of all, I think what we want to do is we want to sort of back up just a little bit and sort of refresh our memory of some of the knowledge that we had in the previous slide that we need to sort of bring with us when we're talking about this particular situation, right? So for instance, the things I want to really point your attention to are the relative melting points of our 2 dominant fats, right? Saturated fats, which last time we all basically said that saturated fats were at room temperature solid, right? And of course, unsaturated at room temperature were liquids. And so those are melting points. So that's basically what we're looking at there. And so when I talk about the margarine effect, really, if you think about it, margarine is probably something that most of us use. Probably few of us actually have real butter in our refrigerator. It used to be the other way around, by the way. It used to be like most people would have real butter in there, and then as margarine kind of started in the 50s or 60s or something like that, every now and then you'd see that, but for the most part, you would see like real butter, and that was kind of it. And just sort of suffered with that. But let's go ahead and take a look and sort of show you what the problem was. Why did we actually even create margarine in the first place, right? Think about it this way. It all has to do with toast. They're like, oh, okay, here's the toast hypothesis of margarine. So I've got all kinds of crazy ideas, right? So I'm like the crazy one. So like when you're like counseling your friends to register for general bio, it's like, okay, the one I had, he was the crazy one. You'll say just about anything, which is almost true, right? But here's the deal, right? I mean, one of the things, especially in the 50s and 60s, like the common work culture, at least in the US, was you get up, you brew your coffee, right? And what? You have maybe a piece of toast on your way to work. That was kind of life, right? And that was pretty much every day. But here's the problem. If you have toast in the toaster and you're hungry, and that toast comes out and you take out your butter, your real butter, out of the refrigerator, what is that real butter like? How easy is that to use? If you've ever danced with real butter, you can hammer nails with it, right? I mean, it is hard. And of course, this is what we have, right? So we have to butter our toast because that's what we want to do. How's that going to go for you with your brick solid real butter? Yeah, right? I mean, you kind of, first of all, it's like you need like a reticulating saw to actually cut through the butter itself, right? So I mean, it's not, I mean, I remember as a kid, just like putting my whole body weight on that thing to try to get the knife actually through the butter. It was so solid. And then, of course, then you go and you're like, okay, I got to butter my bread now. So, and you put the butter on the bread, and what happens to it? Does the butter melt on the bread? Yeah, but it has to be flaming hot though, right? I mean, most toast is really not that hot. I mean, you can basically hold it with your hands for the most part. It's warm, not hot. But your butter just sits there, right? And of course, great. Now I got to figure out how to spread this. And so what do? Start spreading it. And then what happens to your bread? Basically, you just got bread shreds. now, right? So there goes your toast. You get frustrated, and what do? Just screw it. I'm just going to drink coffee today. I'm gone, right? And that's how we turned into the coffee culture. But that's obviously a problem, you know. And then we kind of do cute little tricks, right? Like instead of cutting it like that, we kind of start shaving like little. Right? Are you a top shaver, a butter shaver? Right? We're all butter shavers. That works a little bit better, but it's still not perfect, is it? Right? Okay. So what's your alternative then? Well, obviously we have a melting point that is just too high. Right? It's a solid at room temperature. We can't get this thing to spread on our toast, which is warm at best. So what's our alternative? Well, let's go back and let's pick the other type of fat, unsaturated, right? So here we have a liquid. So let's say we grab the olive oil and we're thinking, okay, maybe I can spread this on the toast. Is that going to work out for you? No. By the way, none of that Roman dipping thing, right? No, you don't put the little acetabulum full of olive oil and you dip it. That's cheating. No dipping in this house, right? You're spreaders or you're nothing, right? You're not dippers. So that's cheating. None of that. So obviously, are you going to be able to spread the olive oil? No, you stick a knife in there. You're like, okay, I can't even pick it up with the knife. So what do? You kind of start drizzling it on the bread. And then of course, invariably, you don't get that right, do you? And so you got a part of your bread that's just like an oil sponge and another part of it that doesn't have anything on it. And then pretty soon you just have this dripping, greasy piece of bread. And you're looking at it like, why am I doing this to myself? And then of course what do? Give it to the dog, right? And you grab your coffee and you go. Either way, you're leaving the house with coffee only. There's obviously a problem here, isn't there? Enter the margarine effect. So what we wanted to do in industry was we wanted to basically solve this problem. How do you solve this problem? It's quite easy. Essentially what you want to do is you want to create a lipid that has a melting point that hits the sweet spot for toast. That's where the toast piece comes in, right? That is to say that you want it to have a high enough melting point to where it sets up in the refrigerator like butter, right? So you don't want like, the little butter saucer full of just like, bleh, right? That's gross. Nobody wants to touch that. So you want it to look and feel like butter. Why? Because at that point, you had a generations actually, of people who were used to seeing the little solid stick of butter. So if you want them to buy it, you've got to make sure it looks like something they're familiar with, especially in that generation, which were notoriously non-experimental, right? So it had to set up solid like a stick of butter in the refrigerator, but it had to have a low enough melting point so that when you brought it out into room temperature, it would soften up and you would be able to actually spread it on toast so that the temperature of the toast would be hot enough to melt this new lipid so that you can actually spread it on your toast. And then you actually have a nice buttered piece of toast that you can enjoy instead of cursing and swearing and just living on coffee only, right? And how do you do that? It's very simple. All you do is you mix your saturateds plus your unsaturated. So on one end of the spectrum, if you have a fat that's all saturated, you're going to have a brick of lard, right? Not good enough. On the other end of the spectrum, if you're all unsaturated, you're going to have thin, runny liquid. Also not good enough. However, if you were to mix saturateds with unsaturated, you can create an entire spectrum of consistencies just by the ratio of saturated and unsaturated. So if you want it to be mostly solid, but have a little bit more softness to it than butter, then you have it predominantly saturated with a little bit of unsaturated mixed in there. That drives that melting temperature down a little bit. If you want it to be spot on 1-to-1, then you have as many saturated as unsaturated. And so you're going to have a much lower melting point. If you want it to be mostly liquid, But you want to have a little bit of solidness to it. Olive oil is a perfect example of this one, right? Some oils like canola oil and vegetable oils, which are mostly all unsaturated, you can stick those in the refrigerator and they will remain a liquid, right? But have you ever tried olive oil? What happens to olive oil when you put it in the refrigerator? It hardens up, right? So what that means is even amongst the liquid lipids, you have a little bit of variation there, right? So the canola oil is mostly all unsaturated. It's so runny that its melting point is so low that it's never going to actually set up in the refrigerator. But olive oil, which has maybe a few more saturated fats in there, is going to set up in the refrigerator, but it's going to stay liquid at room temperature. So in a lot of ways, olive oil kind of has that sort of little sort of margarine-ish type of effect to it. And so all we did really was basically engineer a lipid by mixing these saturated and unsaturated fats so that you could pull something out of the refrigerator and butter your toast with. That's the margarine effect. Now, if you notice though, in the margarine group, not all margarines are the same, are they? Like you'll have some margarines that are a little higher on the melting point because they sell those in the sticks, right? And usually they kind of replace those for like whenever a recipe calls for butter, then you grab the stick, right? So it's a little more solid. It's designed to be a little more solid. So it has more saturated fats in it, but it's still a margarine, right? It's still fairly soft. You can still cut through it. And I always love those sticks, right? Because they have the little pre-measured, like, so just kind of cut here and that's your quarter stick or half stick, depending on what your recipe calls for. And so that is useful for us for baking purposes. That's why they make those, is because it's more for us to utilize for baking purposes. But for spreading, that's where you get the tubs. You notice the tubs are a lot softer, right? You stick a knife in there and it's just like cream. I mean, just like you can kind of dig it in there and it's really soft because its goal is not, they don't make that for cooking. They make that one for spreading. So this is the one they intend for you to spread on your toast. When you're baking, that's why they package a higher melting point in the sticks so that you can use those more for baking, because you're not spreading those, you're just clopping off a chunk of it and tossing it into your recipe, right? So even amongst the margarines, you have an entire spectrum of some that are a little more solidish, some that are a little more liquidish. Okay. That idea of trying to manipulate the system in order to strike the perfect balance to give you the right consistency is something that is massively important, especially for our next group of lipids, which are the phospholipids. Now, the phospholipids are very similar to triglycerides. They have the same basic structure. So they have your 3-carbon glycerol backbone. They have 2 fatty acids attached to 2 of those carbons, just like you have with the triglyceride. The only difference now is on that 3rd carbon, instead of a 3rd fatty acid, you have a phosphate, polar phosphate head attached to it. And this basic polar phosphate head is a very disturbed individual, right? So up here, you have a very polar head. Down here, you have non-polar tails. The 2 are linked covalently to each other. Think about that for a second as we take a look at some alternative structural representations of a phospholipid. So you can see here's the actual, this is like the nerd territory right here, right? So that's getting your chemistry nerd on. So you can see your fatty acids. So you can see this like little ester bond right there, right? So that's holding your 2 fatty acid tails onto your glycerol molecule. And then here's your phosphate that's attached to an actual choline. So choline is also very polar as well. So we just kind of consider this whole group, this phosphate choline plot complex, as the phosphate head, okay, that polar phosphate head. And oftentimes it's just abbreviated and cartoonized like this, like just a big ball with 2 little legs on it. Okay, and that's basically how I write it. Now let's think about this for a second. So we have a polar phosphate head attached to non-polar hydrophobic tails. how do these two parts of the molecule feel about each other? Are they happy to be one and the same? How does a hydrophobic molecule feel about a hydrophilic? Yeah, as an understatement, right? So remember, this is that sort of overboard, like massive hate between these two molecules. They basically are looking to destroy each other from the face of the planet and from the universe, right? Remember the organizational power of water? Remember the hydrophobics hate the hydrophilics so much that all I have to do is stand in the middle of you guys in order for you guys to be, to organize you guys to kind of basically sort of, you guys just are repelled by me if I'm water. We're talking about a deep, deep, deep hatred for each other. And now what do? We put you both together. So think about like ultimate evil. I mean, like supernatural levels of evil, right? So levels of evil that we can't even comprehend. And ultimate good, right? And then basically put that inside the same skull. Both of them. That's a fractured psyche, right? So half of you is desperate to kill the other half. But you don't, because you would kill yourself. So you're kind of like stuck, right? So wait a minute, I want to kill myself, but I don't want to kill myself, right? So my non-polar personality wants to kill the polar personality, killing myself. But I don't want to kill my non-polar self. So I want my non-polar self to live, but I want to kill the polar part of it. So I want to kill myself, but I don't want to kill myself at the same time. That's a disturbed individual, yes? Is it fair to say that there's a little bit of tension in that person? Right? You're kind of oscillating between self-hatred and self-loving at the same time. I love myself and I hate myself at the same time. And they're like exceptionally high levels of hate and love. I mean, it's like really, wow, you need help, right? Like maybe a medically induced coma would be an improvement, right? That's what we're talking about. Now, the reason why I point that out is because this is like some sort of a cruel joke, right? It's like, this is like what we do with reality TV. We take two people that hate each other, we put them like together, and then we turn the cameras on, right? And that's called reality TV. It works, right? Because usually somebody's dying at the end of it, and that's all a lot of fun to watch. Because we're all Romans at heart eventually, right? We don't necessarily feed people to lions, but kind of we do, right? We feed them to Big Brother house. That's kind of the same thing. But here's the thing that I want to lay down, right? Because we've already seen it a little bit, but I want to double down on it. And that's doubling down on that organizational power of water, right? We've already seen how having that tension between hydrophobics and hydrophilics is work to our advantage, right? So water can come in there and organize non-polar molecules like without even doing anything, without paying any money for it. You don't have to sweet talk them to do that. All you have to do is just be there, right? And it's like you get immediate structure without cost because of the nature of this tension. So this is actually kind of a universal concept. Actually, it cuts across lots of fields and lots of divisions. And if you get good at it, you can see the trick. It's kind of like discovering the magician's trick, the sleight of hand that the magician uses. And the magician here is biology, right? So how does biology get all of these cool structures? Well, sometimes what they do is they use a little bit of sleight of hand by creating situations that are high in tension. Like this, right? I mean, this would be one of those situations that are high in tension, right? When you have a molecule that is equally self-hatred and self-loving, that is tension. But there's a universal idea of tension. All tension demands what? Yeah, resolution. And if you're good at it, if you know what you're doing, then this resolution can be actually quite beneficial. Think about it for a second. Because this is so ubiquitous, a ubiquitous concept, it cuts across just about everything. We'll talk a little bit about biological tension and resolution, but I don't want to talk about biology right now. I want to talk about music again. Right? Here you guys, I know you guys are like, here he goes. Right? No, but this is important, right? Because this is the reason why I want to talk about this one is because a perfect analogy for what cells do, right? This kind of painting a picture of the intentionality of tension. And what I want to do is I want to go into music. I want to go into music composition. I'm going to use an example, not a recent one, because current music is actually fairly shallow and spineless, actually, if you think about it. Most songwriters have no clue what they're doing. They just happen to luck into a tune and they make money off it. That's pretty much mostly current music writing. Now, what I want to do is I want to go into classical music. I want to go into a specific era of classical music, the classical era. So that's the era of Mozart. And I want to hang on Mozart. And the reason why I want to hang on Mozart is because Mozart's probably one of the most well-known composers, even to people who aren't into classical music. Most of us probably will recognize one of his melodies. Even if we don't recognize that as Mozart, we'll kind of like, oh yeah, I know that one. It's like a lullaby or something like that. Yeah, that's Mozart, right? So one of the things that I did at UC Davis as a gen ed thing, right? The dreaded gen ed thing, right? You have to do some sort of a non-science class. And of course, everybody at UC Davis dreaded that, right? It's like, great, I got to go to the other side of the campus and hold hands with people, right? And so we dreaded it. But I took a Mozart class and it was actually quite fascinating to me because I was already a fan of classical music. And I already liked Mozart because Mozart is just really likable. I mean, just he has very charming music. But the professor that taught it was like a Mozart scholar. So she was a musicologist. So she was like a total music nerd for Mozart. So she was like a German lady and she was all about Mozart. And so it was fascinating. So we didn't just like sit around like music appreciation, hold hands and listen to music, right? That's not what we did. That's what I thought we were going to do. But man, this lady broke us down. I mean, she would take like Mozart and then she would like dissect everything that he was doing in like a piece of music. And it was really fascinating because especially in the classical era. Now, once you get the Romantic era, Beethoven just turns everything on its head. But in the classical era, it's actually quite fascinating because music then, symphonies, for instance, were written in a very formulaic fashion. And so what we did in this class was break down, like take one of Mozart's symphonies, like his 40th or his 41st, and we literally just break it down movement by movement and dissect and map exactly what he was doing. And one of the things you learned was that it's not just random. He's not just out there whistling tunes like we do now. That's how we write music today. We just kind of go out there, we just sort of blunder into melodies and we're like, oh, hey, that sounds pretty good. Let's go ahead and write it down and make money off of it. That's kind of how we do it now. It's not the way Mozart did it or anybody in his generation did it. There was a very strong formula where you had melodies, not just one, oftentimes multiple melodies, many times in conflict with each other. And you had different keys, which had different effects. So you kind of had in his first symphonic movement, he would basically take what's called the tonic and the dominant. So there's two different types of keys going on that are kind of in opposition to each other. And then he would work in one, and then he would dive down into the other. So he'd start off in the dominant, and he'd work down into the tonic, and he'd kind of come back up into the dominant and back into the tonic. And he would kind of weave different melodies. Usually he had something around the range of 4 different melodies that he would introduce, and he'd kind of weave them together a little bit, introduce them to us. And then in the middle section of the symphony, it was called the development. This is where he just went nuts. This is where you just said, okay, I just introduced you to the melodies that I'm using. Now I'm just going to open up Pandora's box and I'm going to go crazy on them. So oftentimes what you could hear him doing is you can hear him pitting one melody against the other, creating like a dissonant clash, and also creating a sense of desire in the listener for a specific outcome, right? So this tension that's created between these conflicting melodies naturally created a sense of yearning in the listener to see some sort of a resolution to this conflict. And he would kind of develop this conflict, and it would create more and more tension musically. And then eventually, the thing that's nice about the classical era is they were nice to listeners. They, at the last part of it, would tie all of these things up. They would bring the conflict back down. There would be resolution. They would, instead of clashing the melodies against each other, would weave them together like they all belonged together. And then to the listener, that was like sonic resolution. That was like, I'm kind of like on edge because I want to hear some sort of resolution to this. And then Mozart would basically pull it all together. He would resolve all of these tension endings. And then at the end of it, you'd be like, oh, that's really nice. Let's go hear it again, right? And it was very intentional. So when you look at what he's doing, he's intentionally creating a sense of tension in the music because he knows that as a listener, you're naturally going to desire the resolution. And if he gives you that resolution, then that's like your feel-good moment, right? That's kind of like, scratching an itch. It's like, okay, that feels good. That feels good now. Okay. And the classicist, because it was so formulaic, it's really, really easy to see that. The most classical music is like that, right? So when you hear a composer do something in a piece of music, it is oftentimes not random. They're not lucking into that one. They didn't just whistle that tune skipping down the pathway on a morning walk. They're doing something very intentional. They're getting inside your head and they're screwing with you, right? The modern version of what Mozart did is movie music. Has everybody ever watched a horror movie without the music? Try it. Turn the sound off. Right? Friday the 13th is like, whatever. It's just like an A&P lesson. It's like, whatever. I can see that in the cadaver lab, right? But have you ever listened to the music without the movie? Yeah, right? I mean, even the music by itself, you don't know what's going on. I have no idea what's happening, but wow, whatever it is, it sounds really bad, right? Because you can hear the composer intentionally sowing tension into the music, and that builds up your emotions to a place where it's like, you're about ready to just blow, right? And then they kind of release that. They kind of resolve that. And that resolution gives you or gives them what you want, right? You want to go back and listen to it again. And that's kind of our modern equivalent. The classical composers were masters at that. Mozart in particular. A lot of times people don't realize, like, if you ever look at a symphony, you're like, oh yeah, this is a symphony in D minor, as opposed to C major, right? Which is a key. A lot of times people just look at that and be like, well, why do they write it in minor, right? Why don't you write it in D major? Why did the composer pick D minor? Well, it's all strategy, right? So for instance, the minor keys is part of the tension, naturally have a kind of a sonic scale to them that are fairly moody and contemplative, sad, right? That's just the way they're laid out. And there's a lot of dissonances in there. And that kind of puts us emotionally in sort of a sad contemplative state. So like, for instance, a funeral dirge or something that's very melancholy is oftentimes written in a minor key. Something that is rejoiceful, joyful, is going to be in a major key. And in particular, C major. C major is actually called the king's key or the coronation key, because it's the scale of a C, which is the one we learn, like if we pick up piano, right? That's the C scale. So it's the most common one. This one is like very bright and energetic, and oftentimes was used back in the day for things like the coronation of a new king, which there was a lot of those back in those days. And so that's what they would do. They would write some sort of and there's actually, I think, some symphonies called the Coronation Symphonies written in C major, because it was celebrating the installment of a new king. So they were commissioned to write this symphony for that particular purpose, kind of like movie music is commissioned to like John Williams, it seems like. to write the score for the music for the movie. And the same thing was true here, right? You wouldn't write something in C minor for a celebration because that would be very moody and very kind of contemplative, very sort of introspective. You write something very joyful. And so the composers knew that. That's how they pick. That's part of the tension, by the way. They're messing with your moods. They know exactly what system of sounds creates what kinds of emotional effects on you. And they pull you around like puppetry. Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. And it's also it's very nice and pleasant to listen to the Four Seasons. But yeah, he has some really bright sections in there that are in major keys. And he has, like in Winter, there's some very kind of melancholy minor keys, not depressing, but you could definitely tell they're kind of been sort of mooted down a little bit. And the nice thing about the Four Seasons of Vivaldi, which is like the best Four Seasons, there's multiple composers who did seasons, but is because it's like he wrote the music to reflect the mood of the season. So Winter, which is oftentimes the Winter Blahs, is written in that kind of minor sort of like melancholy sort of a mode. So it's very fascinating the way he did that. Listen to it. It's a lot of fun to listen to. But anyway, that tension then requires resolution. And then, of course, the composer gets resolution in the way of a great resolve. And then you love the piece of music. So what does that mean biologically? So we have a molecule that's full of tension. So what is the resolution? This. So first of all, the resolution comes from even more tension, right? Because what's going to steepen this tension of the phospholipid? If we put it in water. Think about it for a second. If you put a phospholipid in water, is that molecule happy? Yeah, it's got a split personality, right? So yeah, the polar phosphate head is happy, but these guys here, woo, not so much, right? So what do you do then? Who do you listen to? Do you listen to your tails who are not happy? Do you listen to your head who is happy? If you make your tails happy, who's going to be unhappy? If you make your head happy, who's going to be unhappy? So is there a way to win this one? Well, there is. You basically form structures like this. This is called a micelle. So essentially your phospholipids will take their greasy little tails, point them all inward. And what that basically does is it kind of creates this sort of region inside that doesn't have any water associated with it. And not that, but all those tails are surrounded by other lipids. So they don't have to worry about the water anymore because they're not being in contact with it. And of course, the heads are happy because these guys are touching water. So now we have happy heads and happy tails. Now, the speed at which this happens is reflective of the nature and the steepness of the tension. If these two molecules were just kind of like, I kind of don't prefer to be around you, but whatever, I don't really care. I'm easygoing. I can take whatever, comes. Then you're not going to be in a big rush to form these micelles, are you? So you're not going to get this. The more you hate each other, the more desperate you are to fix the situation, which means you're going to be in a super hurry to fix the situation. So the speed at which this occurs is reflective of just how strong the tension is in this phospholipid molecule. That's not the only structure you can make. There's another one, the phospholipid bilayer. So here's basically how you make the phospholipid bilayer. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do some walking, and I'm going to come over here to Megan. I'm going to stand right in between you guys. So imagine that we are phospholipids in water. Okay. And actually, since these guys can't see me, you're off the hook, Megan, but not you, Sophia. Messiah, you're very placing. So now we're all phospholipids here, right? And so one of the things that we're upset about, and we're in water, right, is first of all, we can feel water. So let's say, for instance, this right here, our trunk of our body is going to be our phosphate head. our legs are our non-polar tails. Okay, so if we're in the middle of water, our heads are fine, right? So we're happy here, but we can feel water on our legs. So we're like, no, this is not good. So how do we fix this? Well, it's pretty easy, right? So what we do is we basically take another phospholipid and another phospholipid, and I kind of snuggle in right in between you guys, right? So now what happens is my legs are blocked from being access to water, right? So she's blocking this leg. So my hydrophobic tail feels her hydrophobic tail. I'm okay with that, right? And then my hydrophobic tail over here feels her hydrophobic tail. So I'm okay with that. So I'm happy. Of course, you guys aren't, right? So like, Sophia, you're going to want to sort of snuggle up to Megan to block your leg, right? And so that's right. So you'd block that. And of course, Megan, you're kind of now touching water. So you're probably trying to figure out what to do, right? But now, are we happy yet? No. Why? Because my feet can still touch water. So can all of ours, right? So what do? So what I do is I have Amelia lay down that way, and I have her put her feet up against mine. So now she's blocking my feet, right? So now I feel her non-polar tails. I'm blocked on either side, right? Now I'm fine. I'm good. So that's like, this is me like right here. So you can see I'm blocked on this side, and then there's Amelia's feet right there, right? So I'm good, but not Amelia, because she's over here, right? And Megan's over here. So are these guys happy? No, right? Because they can still feel water. So what do you do to fix this problem? Add another phospholipid, right? So, okay, let's do that. Now, are we done? Right, so we got to block that one. Okay, are we done? Got to keep going. Okay, when does it stop? Oh, but it does. Because there's one way to fix it for good. Create a circle. Right? So basically, if you create a circle of a phospholipid bilayer like this, everything will be good. Your tails will not be touching water. Your heads will. But what does it start to look like? What? Yeah, right? You're like, looks like the beginning of cell membrane. That's a big deal, right? Because, and this is also like a kind of a leap in development, right? Because instead of kind of grinding through the evolutionary meat grinder, like, okay, wait a minute, how are we supposed to put all these things together? How do we build a cell membrane, right? How did this membrane come together and all that sort of stuff, right? In this particular case, that's not a problem, because how long did it take to make this? Yeah, actually, my biology professor, when I was in general bio back in the day, she actually did this. She actually took a petri dish full of water and a syringe full of phospholipid, squirted the phospholipid into the water, and you know what happened? It formed like a soup skin, which was the bilayer. You know how long it took to do that? Like milliseconds. Like we literally couldn't even time it. We tried to time it. We literally couldn't time it because it happened so fast. Again, the speed at which it occurs is indicative to the tension that's built into the situation, right? It's kind of like having something under pressure. If something has really, really high pressure, then it is going to resolve that tension very quickly. The more pressure it is, the faster the resolution comes, right? This is like, this is like a good example between like volcanoes, right? You get to compare like a Mount St. Helens from 1980 to Kilauea, who's still kind of sputtering and sort of oozing. Well, one, you had pressure, low pressure that releases over time, but the resolution is relatively long time frame, right? That's because the pressures are fairly low, the tension's fairly low. St. Helens, I mean, that was like a nuclear bomb going off. It blew off the entire north face of the mountain. In what? Seconds? Literally, it took seconds for this to happen. I mean, it just went. That's because of the pressure. So there's greater tension in there, which basically meant that you achieve resolution very fast, very violently in this case. Okay. But that shows you just how much tension was built up in that system. So that's kind of an important deal, right? Because we're going to talk more about the membrane in chapter 5. But let's wrap up our lipids discussion with the last group, and that's the steroids. Now, we also have terpenes, which are also a lipid as well. They're not a steroid type. This is kind of like the miscellaneous group. But citronella, for instance, is a type of a terpene. You can see basically what you largely have is a carbon-hydrogen bond. It looks very similar to like a hydrocarbon, only it's got a hydroxyl group and a double bond in there. That's kind of what sets it out as a terpene. There's not a lot of work on this. If you get into organic chemistry, you'll probably work on terpenes. But for the most part in biology, there's not a lot that we do with terpenes. Steroids, however, that's a different question, right? This particular steroid that we're looking at here is cholesterol, the notorious villain of cardiovascular health. So the one thing that really stands out with steroids is they all have this 4-fused ring. And for us in particular, there's different types of steroids, but for us in particular, the reason why cholesterol is important, the reason why you don't want to ever like not eat any cholesterol is because cholesterol actually has a very important biological function in our body, and we need cholesterol. We don't need a lot, right? But we do need cholesterol. Why? Because cholesterol is the precursor molecule. It's the foundation molecule that we need in order to create other steroids that are very important in our body. For instance, testosterone and estrogen, right? What does testosterone and estrogen do? Yeah, these are basically our secondary sex characteristics, right? So our body tissue basically masculinizes under the influence of testosterone. The feminizing of human tissue is driven by estrogen. So if you think about the secondary sex characteristics and also the development of female versus male reproductive organs, that's all driven by testosterone and estrogen. And these are so potent, our tissues are so responsive to these two hormones that you can turn a man into a woman purely with estrogen treatment. That's how powerful these hormones are on our body. And so these are basically the root of our sexual dimorphism, right? The kind of the masculine body development versus the feminine body development that's driven largely by our hormones, by testosterone and estrogen. And these are precursors of cholesterol. So if you don't have any cholesterol, then you're going to start weakening your supply of testosterone and estrogen, right? So you can almost imagine some sort of a medical scenario, right, where somebody like a guy, right, was told to stop eating cholesterol. So he does a great job. It cuts out all the cholesterol, but then starts to realize that he starts to have some testosterone deficiency issues. Would that make sense? Yeah, right, because you're not eating the necessary precursor molecule in order to make your testosterone, right? So these are really, really powerful. By the way, also prescribed steroids, right? Every now and then we'll get a prescription for steroids, usually if there's an inflammation issue that we're trying to get under control. Steroids are actually quite potent for that. But oftentimes patients will have a problem with steroids because they kind of whack you out in the gourd a little bit, which is real. Even though doctors will say like, oh no, this won't turn you crazy. It's like, yeah, it does, right? Just ask the people you have to live with, right? And we're not asking you, right? If you're taking a steroid, we're not asking you, we're asking the people that live with you. They're the ones who know, right? But it is true. And they are really potent, and they can be quite, you have to be very careful with them, right? That's the reason why with steroids, a lot of times doctors will be like, we don't want to prescribe you a steroid, or we're going to be very careful with the steroid we give you. And we want to be careful with how you use it, right? So it's not like a maintenance drug. You don't want to use a steroid as a maintenance drug because they're very potent and very powerful. But a lot of times patients will ask, is this a steroid? The doctor will be like, no, it's not a steroid. First of all, don't believe a doctor. They don't know. They're supposed to know, but the reality is they don't. Most of them don't. All you need to do is just ask for the list, because all medications will come with like that little pamphlet, that little packet of information. They have to. And you can either get that from the doctor or from the pharmacist. Either one of them should have that. And all you have to do is take a look at that, because one of the things by FDA regulations is required in each single one of those is that they have to publish the actual chemical structure of the medication that you're taking. And so if you ever have a question as to whether or not what you're taking is a steroid, just look at that little pamphlet, look for that structure. If you see this 4-fused ring in there, it's a steroid. Doesn't matter what the doctor says. This is a steroid. There's nothing else that has this 4-fused ring kind of shape. So it has that, it's some sort of a steroid. Not necessarily a bad thing, but like I said, just, don't take what your doctor says as if your doctor knows what they're doing, because oftentimes they don't. That sounds pretty mean, but unfortunately that's borne out through a lot of experience and trial and error. Okay, so why didn't you say the first time is what my question is. Okay. Any questions on 3 before we move on? Okay, so now what we did, if you've been following, right, we've been moving up that levels of organization, haven't we? We started off with atomic, we went into molecular, we went into macromolecular, and then we are now ready to go into organelles and then cells. And so organelles and cells are going to be covered in this chapter. And then we'll kind of take a little bit of a pause in our levels of organization, because general bio 1 is all cell and molecular. So we don't go much beyond cell, right? That's what we do. Organismal is bio 2 or AMP. Depends on if you're just looking at all organisms or just the human organism. So that's where that goes. So most of what we spend now is that we're done at the end of this chapter, moving up the levels of organization. Now, at that point, what we're going to be doing is looking at function at that cellular level for the rest of the semester. Okay. So let's take a look then at chapter 4. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to kind of start to lay some of the groundwork, and I'm kind of a bit of a history buff, which is probably I'm kind of a buff of a lot of things. Obviously, a music buff, history buff, pretty much anything buff. I like it. I like it all. It's all good stuff. There's a lot out there to know, and it's all fascinating. But what I want to do is I want to kind of take a little bit of a stroll down history lane, mostly because one of our biggest weak spots in the world is a sound knowledge of history, which is the reason why we keep blundering into the same mistakes. And unfortunately, that's true. The average American probably wouldn't pass even just the most basic history quiz, which is scary. I know some of you guys are like, don't give us one. And that's fine. It's just, as a culture, we don't stress it enough. I think because there's a lot of lessons to learn, right? If you want to have a successful life, a good place to start is by studying the lives who've gone before you and actually try not to make the same mistakes they did. Right? That's where the history part comes in. Unfortunately, we do just the opposite. We ignore everything that came before us, and we end up blundering foolishly and stupidly into the exact same mistakes that just a generation ago went into. So that's my little thing there. So let's go ahead and take a stroll back. So we're going to talk a little bit about cells. We're going to talk a little bit about cell theory. But before we get there, what we want to do is we want to give you a sense of how all this came to be, right? The entire field of cell biology, which is big now. How did this actually come to be? Well, it all started in the 17th century with two individuals, one an inventor, the other a biologist, like the first cell biologist, right? So Robert Hooke is considered to be sort of the father of cell biology. He's kind of the one who started it all off. But the reason why he started it all off is because also in the 17th century, there was invented a curious little gizmo called a microscope, invented by some Dutch dude, Van Leeuwenhoek, which was essentially just a series of lenses, not unlike taking two different magnifying glasses and putting them in series. And you were able to say, wait a minute, I can make things bigger, right? So if you take a magnified object and you magnify that magnified object, it gets more magnified, right? That's kind of the whole idea. If you recall, one of the take homes from lab 5 was total magnification, right? So your total magnification is the product of all of the lenses in series. So that's basically what's happening is you magnify a magnified object, and you can keep doing that and make it bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, as big as you want, right? And so this was a curious little thing. And of course, Robert Hooke was one of the first ones to really kind of pull it around. He's also the one who coined the term the cells, and he got that from cork. Because if you take a look at cork, it's actually, unlike most types of wood, is composed of little circular cells of wood. And when he looked in the microscope, he noticed something that looked very similar, like little circular types of subunits that he referred to as cells. And that's where the term comes from, is from Robert Hooke. But what I want to do is I want to paint a picture of what it was like to be around in that day, because this is one of those watershed moments in human history, and science is good at this, right? There are punctuations throughout human history where something scientifically happens and it like completely alters the reality of society. Like there is a marked before and after effect, right? So like life will never be the same. Moments when we let Pandora out of the box and it's never going to be the same again. Okay. There are several of those throughout history. Obviously, nuclear technology is one of those, right? We let that genie out of the bottle and we've been living with that genie ever since. We will probably live with that genie forever. Evolution is a good one, right? So that's one that kind of reorganized how people thought about things on a lot of different levels, not just scientifically. But this one is one that's oftentimes overlooked, and that's the invention of the microscope. This one is probably the biggest, actually, of the three in terms of the intellectual shift. And here's the reason why. In the 17th century, this is the Baroque period, Vivaldi, right? The era of Vivaldi, the era of Bach and Telemann. So this is their era in the 1600s. We're not too far from the Renaissance at this point, right? Which is kind of 1400s-ish or so. Now, what came before the Renaissance? And by the way, if you're wondering, this is a Western thing because the historical trajectory of the West and the East was very different. So when we were in the Dark Ages, the East wasn't, right? So like Eastern cultures from the Mediterranean on into China and Asia, they didn't have any of the problems that we had. They were doing fine. So when we say Dark Ages, that is a very kind of a Roman-centered kind of a thing, right? Because Rome was mostly in the West. So it is a very European kind of an idea. But this is where a lot of these guys came from, right? Robert Hooke, a lot of these scientists that sort of built science were Europeans who did it. And obviously, then they were still taking some stuff from the East as well. East was looking at things differently, right? So they kind of, East and West look at things differently, and they're kind of complementary to each other. And that's a bigger discussion, but we don't have time for that one. But just to give you an idea what's happening here, remember, you just came out of the Dark Ages, and they call it the Dark Ages for a reason, by the way, right? Because coming out of the Dark Ages, one of the first periods, if you ever look into art or literature, is the neoclassical era, right? So neo means new, classical. What that means is that we were stupid enough to forget everything we knew, right? Because the Greeks and the Romans had a lot going for them, right? They had a lot of math, they had a lot of philosophy, right? They had a lot of engineering. The Romans were masters at engineering. So we had a lot of really good stuff going for us. Now, granted, the Romans killed a few people and fed a few people to lions every now and then, but hey, we all have our We all have our negatives, right? Right. But the thing is, when the Dark Ages hit, and that was basically the fall of the Roman Empire and the vacuum that was created from that, we lost all that. So we forgot all of our math. We forgot all of our Greek philosophy. We forgot all of our engineering. And so when it was dark, it was dark. I mean, it was dark for a reason, right? We were stupid. I mean, we were stupid. I mean, actually dumb as a brick, right? So that's the reason why we needed the Renaissance. And I like to draw the distinction, because while we were being dumb, the East was doing fine, right? I mean, if you take the time to look into it, I mean, they still had everything going for them, and they didn't crumble. They didn't do this. So this is a very Western sort of a thing when we go into the Dark Ages. But we had to relearn everything we had before. That's the reason why we go into neoclassical. That's the idea of the Renaissance. The idea of a Renaissance is a rising of something from what you were. It's like a resurrection concept, right? So if you were alive and then you were dead and now you're alive again, that's what the Renaissance is like. It's the resurrection of knowledge. But that's happening in the 1400s. Now, you're not too far away from the 17th century. So just to give you an idea, in the West, what held societies together then in the West during that time was not politics, right? Because the Roman Empire, which did hold the world together in the West, was crumbling. And you had a lot of fighting between all the European countries, and Europe was sort of settling itself out. Like, where would be the borders of France? And Germany wasn't even a thing until late into the 19th century. Right? I mean, a lot of people don't realize that Germany was actually Prussia for most of the time, which is an amorphous thing that kind of had amorphous, and all of, Central and Eastern Europe. I mean, it was all kind of in flux depending on who was in charge. And there was a lot of centuries that consumed that. So it was a mess. But who held all that together was the church. Because in that same period of time, as the Romans crumbled, the Catholic Church grew in strength. And even then, it was a curious sort of a thing, right? Because even though you had disparate folks who were considered, oh, we're all Catholics of some stripe or another, they would still kill each other politically. But there was this kind of like common thread, at least in the West, that sort of tied Europe together through this kind of general Catholicism. And so in a lot of ways, I like to think of the Dark Ages as sort of the Catholic Empire, right? And that's kind of what you hear about when you talk about things like the Holy Roman Empire. Holy, that's the Catholic Church. So it kind of held people together. That was the glue that kind of kept society from just fracturing into chaos. And it worked. But the problem is the Catholic Church has a certain way of thinking about things. And that is evidenced in the 17th century. So the leading up to the 17th century, enter the Renaissance, the world was still largely kind of dominated by two fields of thought. Theology, because of the pervasiveness of the Catholic Church, and it was pretty much worldwide at this particular point in the 17th century, plus philosophy to a lesser extent, right? Because we had lost our philosophy when we forgot about what all the Greeks gave us and things like that. So those are the two things that really dominated your reality in the 17th century. Not science, by the way, because science wasn't really around yet. So we only had two fields of thought, and most of it was dominated by theology. So did you have scientists? Sure. You had guys like Copernicus rattling around, right? Kepler doing the astronomy stuff. But they were oftentimes, I mean, their life was a little treacherous, right? Because they were making discoveries that were in opposition to Catholic dogma, and you could get in serious trouble with that, right? And so you had a sense of reality that was dictated largely by Catholic theology. And part of that, and the reason why I like to paint that picture is because it was a very different world back then. Most of our reality is painted not by theology, but by science. And so our entire perception of reality didn't even exist in the 17th century. So what does that mean? So that means, reinforced by theology, is that your reality in the 17th century was only based on what you could see. With the unaided naked eye. So it's only visible, which makes a lot of sense, right? And you could imagine that, that was reinforced with Catholic dogma because, if you take a look at scholarship and all that sort of stuff, there's nothing theologically in there that would seem to suspect that there is anything beyond the naked eye. Actually, that's not true. Theologically, anything that you can't see with the naked eye is put into a completely different realm, the supernatural realm, right? Angels, demons, God, that whole area. So it's like two very distinct worlds, theologically speaking, right? But the idea is there wasn't this sense that there's actually something in our physical world that could be unseen, right? So that was all driven by theology. So now comes along this Dutch joker who invents this toy. And for the first time now, all of a sudden, you're looking at these little structures and you're like looking through the microscope and you're like, look at all that. And you look, there it is. It's gone. There it is. I mean, you can imagine the response to this. What kind of black magic is this, right? What kind of demon hallucination is this? You can almost hear it, right? So you can imagine that this was a difficult time here. Not only that, but your entire reality is based on only what you can see. So all of a sudden, for the first time, you notice that there's actually an entire natural world on the microscopic level. That's like mind-blowing, right? Because here in this era, they didn't have any imagination whatsoever. Like they had no imagination of there even being the possibility of something smaller than what you could see. I mean, it just wasn't there. See, we're in a good place now, right? Because we got science fiction writers and they're kind of like our sort of theoretical physicists kind of, right? They kind of take this stuff, science oftentimes, right? And they kind of imagine. It's like, well, what about this? What if this was true? Let's kind of create this fictitious world and let's sort of just role play. And so when we actually see it happen, it's not that big of a deal. It's like, oh, okay, we saw this one coming because all the science fiction writers wrote it in there, like Star Trek, for instance, right? And the little comment, of course, what does everybody have on them now? A cell phone, which probably in the 60s would have looked very much Star Trek to them, right? But you had science fiction writers imagining the possibilities. And so when they actually happen, we're like, oh, okay, this was not surprising. We had an imagination for this. We had some sort of an idea. They didn't have that back then because they had no clue whatsoever. They were completely blindsided by this. So you can imagine just what this would do to your reality. If all of a sudden, for the first time in your entire life, things that you can't see are out there. And actually, there's more of them than you. So the only way I can do this is to basically do an example for us now. And even then, it's not that good. And Mobina knows what's coming. So I'm going to invent, what am I going to invent, Mobina? I'm going to invent ghost glasses. Right, that's my invention, Van Leeuwenhoek. And what do ghost glasses do? So we're in just a normal empty room, right? Except when I put the ghost glasses on, it allows me to be able to see all of the ghosts wandering around in the room. That'd be pretty cool, wouldn't it? So here's the thing, though. Think about how many people are on this earth. Some 8 billion or so. There's hundreds of millions and more that have gone before the earth. We're not quite sure how many, but it's a lot, yes? So let's just use a page out of Ghostology. And let's just say that, a very modest conservative number, let's say about 10% of these souls that have wandered the earth, for some reason didn't cross over, right? And kind of are just wandering around the earth. 10%. That's a lot of people, yes? You have 10% of 8 billion alone, plus however hundreds of millions of people have gone before us. So you're not just talking about the occasional ghost. You're talking about tons of ghosts, right? Oh, and let's make it better, right? I'm going to blow this one out of the water. No. It's not like Sci-Fi Channel, where they take a picture of a ghost and it's just like walking along a corridor, aloof, like you're not there, like it's some sort of a time loop. No. That's not what's happening. I'm going to pick on Mobina. This one is interacting with you. So it's walking around. It's all like, it's trying to make eye contact with you. It's like, right? So that's what they're like. So there's a lot of them in this room now. Is that kind of a little weird? Oh yeah, there's one sitting right next to Megan on the floor. Just watch out when you step on. Right, is that a little weird? Oh, let's make it weirder. Let's imagine we get up in the morning and it's time we want to take a shower. So we do what we do, right? We strip down to our birthday suit. And there we are, buck naked, getting ready to step in the shower. But wait. I just got to check. Put on the ghost glasses, and what do you see? Yeah, right. They're looking at you. They're kind of checking you out, right? There's some dude, there are 2, 3, or 4 people already in the shower, right? One's on the can. I mean, there's a couple of other people. It's kind of crowded, actually, right? There's one in behind you. You're kind of like, it's like, what are you going to do? Gonna take a shower? Now you're probably like, I'll pass. I mean, I'll be a little ripe at the end of the day, but I'm okay, right? I think my new strategy is gonna be I'm gonna walk through a car wash. That's okay with me. I can do that. Maybe just the sprinklers. I'll just turn the hose on outside. My clothes will be a little bit wet, but I can just throw on dry ones. I'm good there, right? I can handle that one. Oh, let's make it worse. Let's say you and your significant other go out for an evening. And it's a great evening. You guys have a lot of fun. And then you come back and you want to have some intimate time together. And of course, one thing leads to another. And then you head to the love parlor, better known as the bedroom. And you do what people do, right? You kind of disrobe. The engines are revving. You're getting yourself ready. But wait, just let me check, because I got to do this. Let's put them on. And guess what? Yeah, a lot of them, right? There's a couple people over here. They're kind of like trying to talk to you. I'm like, right? There's some dude in the bed like this. And then you kind of look sort of just right over there on the bed by your significant other, and you're like, Uncle Charlie? I thought you died in jail because you were a pedophile. Okay. That's a showstopper, yes? You guys will be like, you know what? I suddenly have a headache. I'm just not going to be able to do this. I think I'm developing heart trouble. I don't think I can actually sustain sexual activity without endangering my health. Maybe, how about tomorrow? Maybe. At least when Uncle Charlie's somewhere else, right? So the birth rates in this country will go way down, right? Think about it. Everywhere you go, whether you have the glasses on or not, you'll know you're not alone. Because every time you put them on, you're like, oh crap, there's a bunch of them right there. Okay, right? So there's nowhere you're going to be able to go on this planet to get away from them. So paranoia will not be paranoia anymore. It'll be actually reality. No, you're not crazy. You're not paranoid. You're actually there. They're staring at you. That guy right there, he's staring at you, right? And that'd be kind of creepy, right? And you can't pepper spray them, right? You can't call the police on them for sexual harassment, right? It's like, what am I going to do with a ghost? I mean, it's like, live with it, right? Would that change the way you live your life? Would that alter your reality? Yeah, nothing would be the same anymore, would it? That's an example of how this was for them. Nothing was the same anymore. Right? Don't worry, there's no ghost classes, so you guys don't have to worry. But I know for those of you guys who believe in ghosts, you're like, crap, never thought about that. Right? It's like, anyway, so destroyed. Maybe some of you guys paranoid now, so I think what I did. Okay, so basically then what you've got is this toy that was developed. And for the first time, we're seeing all these cells. And this became actually the fad toy for quite some time, right? So like if you're a rich person in the know, you got these. I mean, you just kind of played with them. It's kind of the Rubik's Cube of its day. And so you got a lot of it. And in some cases, it was just a game and you just sort of played with it. In other cases, some people actually took it rather seriously. Like Robert Hooke, for instance, took it rather seriously. One of the things you also notice, and some of you have already noticed this, right? Because you probably read enough science textbooks and things like that to notice that all the dudes of science, right, that are mentioned are all, first of all, males, and they're white, and they're rich. Why is that? Well, part of the reason is because in the 17th century, you had basically two types of people. You had real people who were largely poor, desperate, and just basically desperate to scrape together enough food to feed them and their family that day. And so their entire reality, everything all day long was like, how am I going to feed my kids? Right? And so it was desperate living. And then you had a bunch of rich people like this and nothing in between. So you didn't have a well-developed merchant class. You didn't have self-made millionaires. It didn't exist back in those days, right? There were no Mark Cubans. There were no Jeff Bezos. There was no businessmen. None of that. There was no middle class. There was only the haves and the have-nots. The desperately poor, just trying to live to the end of the day, and the insanely rich and useless. And typically speaking, the only people who had time or money to do something like this were the rich people, because the normal people, of which I was probably one, would be too busy just trying to figure out how to feed the family. There was no such thing as discretionary income. There was no such thing as discretionary time. And relative to what they had to live with, even the least endowed among us, right, live like kings and queens relative to what they lived like. So if we were to go back in time with what we have, even like just as modest as our income, as modest as our financial resources are, and go back to those days, we would probably be similar to the aristocrats in terms of quality of life. Never forget that, especially in the West, right? We like to whine and moan when we run out of toilet paper. But take a good, strong, hard look at human history. On our worst day, we've got it good. Better than any human being ever to walk the face of this planet. Don't joke yourselves, okay? So that's kind of a little bit of humble pie, which is hard to come by for Americans, because we are so entitled. Nobody ever had what we had in human history. And that's a big deal. So be thankful for what you've got, because it has been considerably worse, and it can go back there like that. Don't be fooled, right? There's nothing special about us as a people. We can go right back to that desperation. That's my, I don't know what you'd call that. That's not even a history thing. I guess that's a finger wag. That's a finger wag a little bit, right? But you hear a lot about that, right? So just be aware of that. That's the reason why history is so powerful, because you realize, crap, if I lived back then, my life would have sucked. I mean, really, it would have been terrible. So it kind of gives you an appreciation for where you are. And it's not perfect. I'm not saying it is, right? But it's got a lot of more things right than wrong relative to all of humanity. Doesn't mean we don't work on things. It just means that we need to be appreciative of how far we've come while working on getting further. Okay, that's the thing. So basically, you have a bunch of white, rich glitterati who are the only ones who have time basically to do this sort of thing. And if you were rich back in those days, you really did one of two things. You had a lot of time on your hands and you had a lot of money on your hands, and it was family money. So you did one of two things. You either fought with each other in wars, and we have a lot of history of that, or you did some sort of an academic endeavor. And so these guys here did the academic part of it. So some of these white rich aristocrats actually took this seriously. So they recorded what they saw. They made observations of what they saw, and they recorded all down. And they actually did quite a good job. Like Robert Hooke, he was serious about it. And there's a lot of other individuals in this era as well who were like, you know, this is not a game for me. This is really fascinating to me. I really want to understand what's going on here. And so there's a couple of folks that were like that. And so they made a lot of observations. The problem is, you're only going to get so far so fast if it's just pretty much all the rich white people that are doing it, right? And so it took a couple of 100 years before we got enough observations to kind of pull it all together. In the 19th century, Schleiden and Schwann actually did just that. They basically took hundreds of years of observations on cell biology, and then they pulled it together into what we now know as the cell theory. Okay. Now, there's a couple of points I want to make here. First of all, cell theory is based on inductive reasoning. Do you remember that one was from chapter 1? What was inductive reasoning? What? Yeah, so basically that was the one where I sent you guys outside and I asked you, what is the color of the, and everybody said what? Right? And the reason why we knew that was because how many observations of the sky have we done at this point in our life? Yeah, probably millions, right? And have we ever known the sky to be anything other than blue? Right? So the preponderance of observations leads to a conclusion. The sky is blue, not because we did some sort of a fancy experiment to prove that it's blue, right? But because over the accumulation of many observations, we've never seen the alternative be true. That's inductive reasoning, right? It's kind of like the legal version. It's a scientific version of like preponderance of evidence, right? So if you have one circumstantial piece of evidence that convicts you, that's not good enough, right? Because that could just be random. It's just going to be bad coincidence for you, right? But the more of those little coincidental things that we can pile up, that becomes a heavy weight. It's like likely you're not going to have all those happening if you didn't do it, right? An innocent person might have one or two of them, but a guilty person would have all of them, right? That's the preponderance of evidence. And that's the kind of same idea. It's like a preponderance of evidence idea in cells. And so Schleiden and Schwann basically took all of these observations and drew some of these overall conclusions based on these observations. The other thing I want to point out is notice when they did it. They did it in the 19th century. A couple of things always to keep in mind. In terms of a kind of a historical perspective, we always take a look at the 20th century, right? And we kind of like, you know, jaw drop ourselves about all of the amazing technological advances that we got and that we did in the 20th century, right? We basically went from riding horses in 1900 to worrying about Y2K. We're worrying about computers, for crying about, right? In 2000. So that leap, that like exponential leap growth of technology and knowledge in the 20th century, we oftentimes will look at the 20th century and we'll do like, that's amazing what we were able to do. But oftentimes what's overlooked in all of it is where it all started. All of that started in the 19th century. The 19th century saw the seeds of science sown into the soil. Now, is anybody going to get all like up in arms about a little plot of dirt with seeds in it? No, you don't give your loved one on Valentine's Day a little thing of dirt with a seed in it, right? What do? You wait for the flower, right? And you kill it. And then that's what you give to them, right? But make no mistake about it, that flower would not have been there for you to enjoy if you hadn't planted the seeds in the first place. So throughout the 19th century, and actually throughout this chapter, as we go from one topic to another, you're going to notice a common thread that throughout the 19th century, there was many scientists in many disciplines that were laying down seeds in the 19th century that laid the groundwork for that explosion of blooms in the 20th century. So I would like to argue that if we hadn't done this hard work, working the ground, plowing the ground, planting the seeds in the 19th century, the 20th century would never have happened. Right. So I always like to give the 19th century a little love. Okay. The other thing I want you to also maintain is a healthy sense of perspective when you're in the 19th century, because my guess is, any experts in the 19th century history here? Yeah, almost no, right? Even among historians, most of them aren't into the 19th century, right? And the 19th century is sort of like that middle child that nobody ever really pays attention to. They go from the oldest to the youngest, and the middle one just kind of gets lost in the middle. So that's the 19th century. But one of the things I want to do to keep your perspective is where the realities are. Now notice, when Schladen and Schwann are pulling together the cell theory in the 1830s, this predates evolution. Darwin published his paper in 1859. Okay, so that's basically when that came around. And so he was in the process. He'd already done the Beagle voyage, so he'd done a lot of collection. That was, I think, in the 1820s, I believe, when he did that. And now he was probably in his little lab or whatever with all this stuff and trying to make sense out of all. That's what's going on in this particular era. So this is kind of like the formative years of what would later become that kind of outlay of evolution. Okay. And so that's kind of what's happening here. From a historical perspective in America, this is pre-Mexican-American War. So California is not part of the Union at this particular point. It is still Mexican territory. And the gold rush hasn't happened yet. That was 1850 when that happened. So this is kind of what's going on, and just kind of give you an idea of what's going on in America. So Schladen and Schwann then propose a cell theory. So there's a couple of components to the cell theory. The first one is that all organisms are composed of cells. That is to basically say everything that's alive that we're comfortable with as saying, okay, this is alive. Then what we noticed was those are composed of cells. However, determining this was a process. It's easy to us now, yes? It wasn't so easy back then. Yes?
Did they work together or were they separately?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. My guess is they were probably separate, but they knew of each other. They didn't necessarily, and they could have, each one of them could have proposed different components of the theory itself. So, and the reason why I say that is because the whole collaborative thing of scientists, the way we do science now, science wasn't as collaborative back in those days. So they're probably individual, they had different pieces to add to it, but they probably knew of each other. So everything that's alive. So now what does it mean by everything that's alive? Well, remember, when you're, one of the first things you do when you're starting to think scientifically is, in this particular case, is you want to first of all define what alive is, right? What does it mean to be alive? And there's some things that are easy, right? Like, are we alive? Sure, of course we are. Well, what defines that? Well, think about it. We're like mammals, right? We got ears and we're furry. We're ambulatory. We can walk around, right? We can go eat food and things like that, right? There's a laundry list of things that you can imagine that defines life. And you can say, okay, fine, let's use that. A dog, is a dog alive? Yeah, sure, right? So it's also ambulatory. It seems to have a personality to it, right? It's furry. It's kind of like us a little bit, right? Okay, that's fine. Let's keep going. How about a tree? Is a tree alive? Oh, but wait, it can't get around. It doesn't have fur, doesn't have ears, doesn't have personality. It grows, right? So that's another thing. And it does what? It reproduces, and at the end of it dies, right? So we can clearly say this is alive and this is dead. So if it's dead, by virtue of being dead, you must have been alive at some point. So it's a different set of criteria, but it's not the same as us, right? So now we're getting a little trickier. Well, how about like algae in a spongy pond? Is that algae alive? Well, yeah, we know now because there are a bunch of protists in there, right? But think about it then. It's like, well, I don't know. It's just, I mean, it doesn't move around. It doesn't seem to reproduce. It's just sort of there. It's kind of a ball of green slime. I mean, does it really die? I mean, I don't know. I mean, it seems like it's there all the time. doesn't really seem to go away. So it doesn't really seem to die. So is it alive? I don't know. It's a little tricky, right? So the entire process of defining what is alive and what's not alive was a very long process during about the same time, these 200 years or so. Okay. But what we noticed was things that we were comfortable with about defining as alive, we noticed they were all made of cells. And that's actually become so strong now that anything that's made of cells, we can define as being alive, right? And so that's a very strong predictor. The other thing is also that cells are the smallest living things. So what does this basically mean? This means that a cell is the basic unit of life. Which means what? This means this is the smallest we can get. And still answer the big biological questions of life. So when we take things or look at things that are alive, the smallest they ever have, we've seen them is as a single cell. So the cell means that's the bottom, that's the foundation. So that is your first living thing. Okay, and you can't be smaller than that to be a living thing. So anything smaller than a cell is non-living. Anything bigger than a cell is living. Right. So that's part of the cell theory. And the last one seems like a yeah duh moment, doesn't it? This one basically says that cells arise only from pre-existing cells. How many of you guys think that one's kind of a yeah duh? Yeah, from the 21st century view it is, right? But if you think about it, it wasn't a gimme back in those days, right? Because Schleiden and Schwann in sort of the middle-ish 19th century were dealing with a couple of ideas that were sort of persistent in science. One of them was, where does stuff come from? And one of those things that they were dealing with was spontaneous generation. Right? Anybody know what spontaneous generation is? Spontaneous generation is an idea that comes out of, it's pre-Renaissance, but it's reasonable. It's rational, actually. And I love to use this as an example to caution yourself. Even your best explanation for phenomena isn't always the correct one, even if it's well rationed and reasoned. So basically what spontaneous generation is the idea that non-living things can give rise to living things. So like a rock can turn into a frog. I mean, that's a little bit of a stretch, right? But that's basically what they meant, right? So that non-living things give rise to living things. Now, does that sound ridiculous? Yeah, now it does, but guess what? It was still here. It was still around in the mid-19th century. It was persistent. You know why? Because it took Louis Pasteur, the father of microbiology, to basically create sterile technique, which a lot of you guys have been using during COVID, right? So the washing of hands, gloving up, covering yourself, masking up, trying to keep things ultra sterile and ultra clean. That whole idea, that sterile technique, that all had to be invented by Louis Pasteur of pasteurization fame. Right? That's what our milk goes through in order to debunk this one. It was very persistent. I can guarantee you in the mid-19th century, there were well-educated people who were probably in the spontaneous generation camp. And here's basically how it's reasonable and rational. Imagine that you don't have the greatest handle on bacteria, especially microbiology, right? Maybe you might have a loose conception of contamination and things like that, which would drive Louis Pasteur to kind of try to make sure there's very little contamination. But for instance, when you have a piece of meat on the table and all of a sudden you see maggots coming out of it, you don't know where those came from. Because for you, you're not an entomologist. Entomology came much, much later. So you don't make the connection to the housefly laying eggs on the meat. You don't make that connection because the eggs are subvisible, right? So when you see worms coming out of the meat, it looks like, well, maybe the meat just transformed into the worm somehow, right? Based on what you know, that's a testable hypothesis. That's a rational, reasonable hypothesis, right? Because after all, where else did they come from? You're looking around, there's no worms around here, right? You didn't see any worms crawling up to it. It came from nowhere. So where could it have come from? Unless you know more information, that's actually a rational, reasonable explanation. Turned out to be wrong, but it's a rational thing. And this is always the reason why I always kind of caution, like when we take a look at like evolutionary development and things like that, when we're going like way, way, way back in time, where we're having to model all these different possibilities, I always have spontaneous generation in mind. It's like, yeah, it's rational and it's reasonable, and it has a lot of good explanatory power. It explains a lot of phenomena that we see today, but so did spontaneous generation. Please keep that caveat, just like always don't fall in love with that idea so much that you're willing to just basically close the book on it, because someday we're going to be able to measure that. We're going to be like, yeah, you know what, that whole idea you thought was sound, as solid as steel, no, it turned out not to be right, because it takes something like Louis Pasteur to invent an entire field of biology in order to debunk that one. That's what they were doing. This is the reason why they were doing this one, is because they're saying basically, listen, puppies come from, yeah, right, kittens come from, people come from, cells come from. So it only makes sense, right? So cells come from other cells. So that's their statement. Their statement is basically, this is not a spontaneous generation thing. And even though we're kind of in this microscopic world where we think maybe all the rules are different, in this case, it turns out they're not. It also, when you're taking a look at that third one, draws for the first time, actually, this concept that cells are related to each other, just like you're related to your parents, right? You come from your parents. The puppies are related to their parent dogs by a line of descent. Now, remember, this is important. Why? Because in evolution, Darwin has a statement that kind of encapsulates the entire concept of evolution, which is descent with modification. So that's basically what Darwin uses as the term speciation. So the idea is, how does one species become two, right? That's evolution. And so descent with modification is a term that he uses in his paper, right, on the transmutation of species through natural selection. So he proposes a mechanism for it. But when you look at this, this is the first time that you're laying down some of the initial ideas that what you're talking about here is a group of living things that are interrelated to each other by descent. That is a thread that weaves directly into the evolution idea, which comes about 20 years later, right? But that's also important. Why? Because evolution, in a lot of ways, I think, came too early. Because when you take a look at Darwin's idea, descent with modification, what do you think of when you think of descent? What branch of biology? Descent. What does it mean to be descended from somebody? You share their what? Their DNA, right? Descent is basically a genetics idea. So in reality, Darwin was struggling to understand this interrelatedness of organisms, and he was at the organismal level. Schleiden and Schwann are at the cellular level. It's the same idea, right? You have descent with modification concept, but ultimately the heart of all of that is genetics. But the problem is genetics didn't exist for another 15 years. And it wouldn't actually come into full fruition for at least another 100. So really what you had was an idea that Darwin put out there. And it was, I don't want to say half-baked, but a little bit. It was half-baked. Because it is a story of genetics, evolution, descent with modification, speciation, how one species turns into another species is ultimately a story of genetics, because the way that you actually change your traits is a genetic phenomenon. So Darwin himself actually nodded to the fact that, listen, this has got to be some sort of a genetic thing that's going on here, but we didn't have genetics. So what did we end up doing with evolution? It's a pretty substandard job, to be quite honest with you. If you follow that history, this is another big one, the big moment in science and society, by the way, right? Evolution, right? Because this kind of reorganized people, how they think about things and how they think about reality. But one of the things that you have after this is you have the development of the evolutionary theory, but it's largely philosophical and rather unfortunate, actually. It's largely driven by atheists who have kind of like a theological axe to grind, which in a lot of ways does kind of shade and bias sort of their view of things. But it didn't have to be that way. That's just the way it turned out for some reason. But it was very philosophical in nature. And so you were arguing about ridiculous things like fossils and stuff like that, I mean, I'm no fan of fossils. I'm not impressed with fossils at all. Never have been. Even going through UC Davis. You can't say that out loud at UC Davis. Because basically all you have is just a big pile of bones that say pretty much nothing more other than the fact that there was a lot of stuff that lived before us that doesn't live now. That's pretty much what you got. So that was it. There's really no fun, not evolution. On an evolutionary level, there's literally no way to be able to get at the heart of how those evolved, because the heart of evolution is a genetic story. And you can't get to dinosaur DNA because technically their bones are rock. So all you have in a fossil record is just a bunch of dead animals that don't live anymore. And that's it. Don't tell Dr. Adams that. He'll be like, no, Mark, they won't take my historical geology. Take it anyway, right? But that's me speaking as a genomics person, right? So there is a need for reimagining evolution the way it ought to have been. Now that we have all this knowledge of DNA and genomics and things like that, for the first time in human history, we have the actual tools we need to be able to go back and now take a look at these relationships, these descents, these lines of descent, and look at them in the way that's authentic and real in terms of their evolution, which is a change in their genetics and the way they are changing and related to each other genetically. Right. This is the first generation that we've been able to do that. And that's largely because of all these sequencing projects that we've been doing. And we've been able to kind of compare that back and forth. So you can see how a lot of these threads are being laid down in the 19th century. By themselves, they're not big. But when you kind of look back at it, you realize, oh, that was a really important thing that you did there, Schlade and Schwann, because that kind of laid down some of this descent concept so that Darwin could sort of wrap his evolution around it, even though we didn't have genetics in our mind at that point. But there's other things, by the way, like, for instance, Age of the Earth, for instance, was starting to change at that point, because remember, we were slowly kind of coming out of a more kind of a Catholic-based ether. And even then, some of the denominations were already starting to talk a little bit about like old Earth versus young Earth, kind of an idea. So there were already some denominations in the church that were actually already talking about the possibility of older theologies and things like that. And then you add geology. Charles Lyell, for instance, added in a lot of the older stuff in terms of aging, rocks and things of that nature. So all that stuff was kind of coming together in this early 19th century along with this. And that kind of all funneled into ultimately what Darwin pulled together in his paper in the theory of evolution. The one missing piece of it all, though, was that genetic component of it. And that's the reason why I'm not a fan of the fossil record, is because when you look back at evolution, you should see genetics, not bones, right? It's also one of the reasons why I'm really excited about this whole T-Rex soft tissue find, because for the first time ever, maybe if we get lucky, we might be able to find T-Rex DNA. That would be like earth-shattering. That would be amazing. That'd be amazing. Jurassic, yeah, the entire Jurassic suite. But yeah, but see, then though, you could actually tell them, right? They were grappling, weren't they? I mean, I remember when they first did that, when they first did the whole blood from the mosquito thing. I remember actually them getting heckled for that from the scientific community. It's like, oh, that's not possible. You're not going to be able to do that because, you know, the other thing. And it's like, and it's just kind of like poetic justice now, because it's like, oh, well, not only did you not get, you know, DNA from a mosquito, but you've got actually something worse than that. You've actually got proteins from a T-Rex, from a 65 million year old bone, you've got actual soft tissue, which shouldn't be possible. That pretty much shatters all that criticism. This is one of the reasons why just when you think you know it all and you get all critical and arrogant on yourself, watch it, because you're about ready to go down. Like the T-Rex discovery took a lot of egos down. But it's also fascinating because now all of a sudden, for the first time, Jurassic Park may actually be possible. That'd be awesome. I mean, I would love to go to the zoo and see a T-Rex. Right? As long as it didn't eat me. Yeah, right. Yeah. The lawyer guy, right? The lawyer guy sitting on the can. That's the one I love. Right? That's where we want all of our lawyers right there. But anyway, okay, so that's it. So we'll pick up with cell size next time.
I'm gonna take a few minutes